Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Before we get started with our first panel, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have a publication opportunity with the Tulane Journal of International and Comparative Law. In your registration packets, you should have received a form like this with guidelines for publication. The one thing that I would add to what's in these instructions is that if you plan to submit, you should submit your papers by October, and you should submit your papers both to the journal and also copy me so that I'm aware that you've made a submission to them, because all of the symposium, or excuse me, conference papers will be collected together. This morning we have some very distinguished international speakers. We have William Pettigrew, who is a reader in history at the University of Kent, and he's written a history of the Royal African Company entitled Freedom's Debt, the Royal African Company and the Politics of the Atlantic Slave Trade, 1672 to 1752. So we continue our historical focus with this panel as well. We also have Nancy Zhao. Is that the correct pronunciation? I'm sorry, I don't speak Dutch. Nancy is a PhD candidate and lecturer of visual culture at the Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And she's one of the initiators of the Mapping Slavery project, which maps out the traces of the Dutch role in the history of slavery. I became fascinated by Nancy's work when I had an opportunity to go to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. There's a volume that's actually, I think, available at our registration table called the Amsterdam Slavery Heritage Guide. And what a wonderful project. And I keep telling folks that we should have a similar project here in the U.S. with every urban center, certainly, but hopefully eventually every locality that has a slavery heritage. Here in New Orleans, our outgoing mayor has now made himself famous, and in some circles perhaps infamous, for removing the Confederate iconography around the city, or at least some of it. Andrew Jackson is still in Jackson Square. And we're thinking about ways that we can replace that iconography with iconography which is more reflective of the diversity of our city. I think it's important to preserve this history, and the nice part about this project that Nancy was involved with is that you can give yourself a self-guided tour of places that are important to the history of slavery. We also have Miriam Kotias, on the panel. She's a senior researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. Is that how you pronounce?
Scientifique, yeah.
Scientifique. And she's written a book called La Question Noire, en construction coloniale.
Very good.
Okay. Testing my French this morning. Again, very distinguished panel, and they will talk about the question of reparations in their respective national contexts.
All right. Thank you, Robert, and thanks also to the GAM family for supporting our gathering, and also to Jake for all his hard work and the others who supported us in getting here. And thank you to the other speakers and contributors so far. I mean, I've rarely seen a cross-disciplinary conversation work so well, so it's a real privilege to be here. Of course, I'm going to be commenting on the British perspective. It's a bit difficult to be the sort of warm-up person for Sir Hilary, who's going to do a much better job than I can do later on making the case for reparations in the British context. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take off where Professor Darity left us yesterday with, I think, a very important observation that, it's not going to be judicial fiat that helps us to achieve reparations. It's something that can only be achieved through political means. And when I mean politics, I don't just mean kind of hard politics, but electoral politics and political mobilization. So the gist of what I'm going to say, if you like, the political obstacles, the cultural obstacles to that process that exist within Britain, and how those political obstacles are themselves related to British history and British culture, and especially politicians' selective approach to the history of Britain's relationship to slavery and the slave trade. And again, the specific focus I'm going to take, because I only have 21 minutes, is about something that's on the masthead of the conference that we haven't, I don't think, really spoken about explicitly, which is constitutional reform, the rule of law, and how these things could be upheld or inhibited by the case or implementations of a reparations movement. My work is really to demonstrate that, contrary to what we've always been taught in Britain, constitutional reform and the rule of law are causes of slavery and the slave trade, not causes of the abolition. And we need to understand much more and develop a much more complicated relationship between constitutional reform, the rule of law, and racial reconciliation. So as you can see, I've got David Cameron up on the first slide. His face sort of says it all about various different things. British Prime Ministers of the last 10 years have turned with remarkable consistency to the abolition of slavery to substantiate their vision of British greatness. For British politicians, abolition has provided a story to galvanize national optimism. It has also offered evidence of Britain's moral stature for a world stage increasingly uninterested in the United Kingdom. So I've actually done the research on this. Every single time a British Prime Minister in public is asked to define what Britishness is, or what is great about Great Britain, they would mention the abolition of the slave trade. They mention cricket and warm beer and other things, but the abolition of the slave trade is always there. In contemporary British politics, Britain's involvement in slavery has been reduced to British involvement in the abolition of slavery. So, we can't be too surprised about British politicians wanting to have a positive outlook on British history. Hopeful national stories are, of course, the natural playthings of statesmen and women dependent on national political mandates. And history is a fundamental resource for such national imaginings, especially in Britain. But the ingredients that politicians use to produce their nationalist concoctions ought to be chosen with care, for fear of alienating sections of the nation they wish to lead, and to avoid exposing the nation to international mockery, not to mention opening up themselves to the charge of propagandist distortion of the past. And I've done a bit of work with a race equality think tank in the UK called Runnymede Trust, and actually it's becoming increasingly clear that the sort of electoral distribution of racial minorities in Britain is going to make those minorities very powerful in electoral politics within the next 10 or 15 years. So we were talking, again, on the back of what Professor Darity said about the electoral mechanics of the reparations issue. Those are shifting quite strongly in Britain in a way that will make this issue, I think, much more mainstream. The case of Britain's abolition of slavery is especially cautionary. Isolating the abolition of slavery from slavery itself in the context of national chest beating is profoundly problematic. The English, then the British, were late starters in the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved Africans, but became its supreme contributors during the trade's 18th century zenith, transporting more slaves during that century, almost 3 million, than the rest of the European competition prior to abolition. British perfection of slave trading was no less remarkable than British abolition. But privileging abolition over slavery in the national story is only part of the problem. If the causes of slavery are examined, and I think we've been talking about the analogy well, it's not an analogy, but if we talk about slavery and the slave trade as crimes against humanity, one thing we haven't really spoken about is the motive, other than a sort of timeless assessment of greed, which you can place in any kind of historical context. For me, the motive is inextricably linked to the causes of slavery, and I'll be examining those today. That is the ideas, the institutions, and values at the center of what it meant and still means to be British emerge as tools for the entrenchment of enslavement. The horrors of slavery for millions of enslaved African children, women, and men were hewn from the same ideological rock as the determinants of Britishness. This symbiosis of slavery and Britishness makes what we might call Britain's nationalist, abolitionist mantra not only obnoxiously selective in its treatment of the past, but also entirely self-defeating. So again, if you were to raise the question of reparations to a sort of representative audience in Britain, the cliche they would give you is, why visit the sins of our ancestors on us? But actually, there are various things about history that are still live, and we embrace those core determinants of British identity. We can't embrace them without acknowledging their complicity in developing slavery and the slave trade. So there's a sort of impasse. In this brief talk, I'll discuss Britain's involvement in slavery. I could approach this problem from a variety of angles. Historians since Eric Williams have demonstrated how British commerce and industry succeeded because of the transportation, torture, rape, and murder of enslaved Africans. Slavery and slave trading produced huge private fortunes for many British people, generated significant public bounties for the British state through customs duties. The British state also channeled vast resources into protecting its slave-based economy and raised huge sums to compensate the white victims of slave emancipation, as we heard yesterday. Today I want to supplement these accounts by considering something less material, more elusive, and more protean, but I hope no less relevant to our present discussion. Today I want to consider the mutually supporting involvement of slavery in shifting definitions of British identity. Why is this important to today's conversation? Like the legacies of slavery and the British state itself, British identity is a live concern with an uninterrupted connection to the past. British identity helped to develop historic slavery and therefore has its own debt to pay to the present. The conjoined histories of Britain and slavery can best be seen in the final decade of the 17th century and the first decade of the 18th century. So I'm going to go into a sort of historical case study just for a few minutes. A period when Britain itself was formed and many signature features of the nation's constitutional and ideological identity were set: parliamentary monarchy, deregulated press, modern theories of economic growth. During this period, the slave trade became the focal point for a vibrant and inclusive debate that generated several core features of the British nation's creation story. Several of these features derive from earlier English traditions of constitutional exceptionalism, but with first the constitutional change of the late 1680s and second the Act of Union with Scotland, these features enjoyed some changes of emphasis. This debate about whether a state-backed monopolistic joint stock corporation, the Royal African Company, should manage the slave trade, or whether it should be, or whether it was each of British subjects' birthright to be able to participate in the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. So there's the trademark, if you like, of the Royal African Company. The Crown-sponsored African Company gave explicit state support for the English slave trade and became a remarkably effective business. Founded in 1660, the Royal African Company helped England to supplant the Dutch and Portuguese in the slave trade. It became the largest human trafficking organization during the period of the slave trade, shipping almost 150,000 enslaved Africans, mostly to Barbados during the 1670s and 80s. But as a monopoly supported by the Crown, with the help of a civil law enforcement power, it appeared to offend pillars of an emerging national identity: the right to trade, the right to lobby to uphold individual economic interests, and the international portability of national birthrights. While the African Company could lay claim to receiving the support of the English state, it laid itself open to the charge of ignoring the interests of the English nation. So the company was established to kickstart England's involvement in the slave trade, but very early on it became an offence to various different English constitutional traditions. And so a campaign was mounted to deregulate its monopoly, and that campaign's sort of slogan was freedom and constitutional reform and the rule of law. The public campaign to celebrate the slave trade lasted from 1689 to 1712 and absorbed as much, if not more, parliamentary time as the more famous campaign a century later to have the slave trade abolished. By 1712, the African Company's monopoly was unenforceable, undermined by a sustained lobbying offensive in Parliament that gathered an impressive public support for a free trade in the enslaved. Britain's transatlantic slave trade became, as a result, supreme in capacity, increasing by 300% as a result of the deregulation. Just to put that in context, that's an additional 1.5 million enslaved Africans transported under the banner of freedom. Its centre of gravity shifted away from London and towards the provincial outports of Bristol and Liverpool. The destinations for the enslaved shifted northwards from the Caribbean to mainland America. This is the point when there is a direct supply of enslaved people to what is now the United States, again under this banner of constitutional reform and freedom. The campaign to destroy the African Company fused emergent ideas of Britishness together with nationalist justifications for slave trading on an unprecedented scale. It's worth examining some of these connections in detail. I'm going to highlight three. First, the workings of the national constitution and the common law and the ways in which constitutional change assisted the entrenchment of slavery. Second, the role in particular of the British Parliament within a new British political culture. And third, the explicit and intrinsic connections between ideas bundled together under the elastic banner of freedom and the proliferation of slavery on an unprecedented scale. So slave trade escalation depended upon constitutional changes regularly depicted at the heart of British self-imagining. So the foundation of our current constitution is at its heart the cause of slave trade escalation. The African Company's enforcement power for its monopoly derived from the long-established constitutional potency of the royal prerogative. Rival long-lived constitutional techniques gained new power and acquired nationalist associations in the years 1688-89. These included the common law suspicion of monopolies and celebrations of the right to petition to uphold economic concerns. Both techniques would become mainstream with the departure of King James II and the revised constitutional settlement of William of Orange that placed Parliament at the centre of overseas trade regulation. So the rule of law and its kind of classic brand, which is associated with Magna Carta and constitutional reform, all connected to the establishment of slavery. And the key figure here is Sir John Holt, who's legal scholars who know a lot about the history of the common law. This is a kind of he's a sort of titanic figure in the history of common law jurisprudence. He presides over a series of decisions that give common law support for the escalation of slavery, and that's not fully understood. In the abolitionist campaign, of course, Granville Sharp and other people say the common law is intrinsically oppositional to slavery. But as I said, 1.5 million enslaved African people are transported under the auspices of this common law decision. In the spring of '69, during the so-called Glorious Revolution, a leading barrister in the Court of King's Bench, Bartholomew Shower, made a successful argument in favour of slave trade expansion. Shower placed great importance on the right of Parliament to regulate the trade and viewed parliamentary approval for a deregulated trade as expresses of national consent. Shower explained why parliamentary management of the trade was preferable to management by the monarchical company. Quote, "Each subject's vote is included in whatsoever is there done. An act of Parliament hath the consent of many men, both past, present, and to come," he explained. Shower formulated a common law manifesto for independent slave trading. In so doing, he fastened a basic ingredient of national identity to the enlargement of the slave trade. English common law, so Shower contended, distinguishes between bondmen, whose estates are at their lord's will and pleasure, and free men, whose property none can invade, charge, or take away but by their own consent. Free from slavery themselves, so Shower reasoned, the English were protected in their right to develop their property in other human beings. The full-scale British slave trade was the result of the rise of primacy of a national constitutional tradition that privileged the liberty of the subject over all else. Without their national consent, the British could not be deprived of their constitutional birthright, their freedom to prosper from slavery. The right to trade in slaves then became equivalent with such sacred British rights as the right to political representation and the right to habeas corpus. The largest forced intercontinental migration in human history would be the right, the will, the result, and the pleasure of the British nation. Aligning the British national cause and identity with the cause of slave trade escalation was as crucial to the success of the campaign to enlarge the slave trade as slavery would be to the realization of British greatness in the next century. These arguments routinely appeared in Parliament, and basically speaking, the proponents of slave trade escalation were the ones who were using modern political techniques, petitioning, pamphleting. They celebrated the right of the provincial outports throughout Britain to participate in the slave trade to prevent the African company from engrossing slave trading in London. They looked to a time when all social classes would enjoy the benefits of the slave trade and not just the privileged plutocrats of the African company. Here again, they connected an expanded slave trade to national need and to jingoistic conceptions of national birthrights. So with supreme irony to our eyes, the campaign to liberalize the slave trade became a cause that championed national and individual freedom over slavery. To rally their cause, slave traders celebrated the right to trade as an inherent feature of the national character. One wrote, "Freedoms of trade are the fundamental point of English liberty." Another pamphlet in the dispute asserted that monopolies are, quote, "the badges of a slavish people. If this so beneficial a trade was but freed from that nest of drones, the African company, and industry left at liberty further to improve it, the nation would quickly be convinced that nothing hitherto but an English freedom has been wanting to extend the trade." Britain escalated and expanded the slave trade and slavery in the name of British liberty. With each year of the political campaign to expand the slave trade, British people, ideals, institutions, and identity became more and more inseparable from the desire to celebrate the trafficking of enslaved Africans, and became therefore more foundational to the campaign's success and more detrimental to enslaved African lives. The campaign's length, the number of people involved, the scale of petitioning, the number of pamphlets, justifications, arguments, and counter-arguments that derived from the campaign provide enough information to show that British society values and venerated political institutions promoted slavery long before the abolitionists began to criticize it. The development of the slave trade and the consolidation of American slavery cannot be separated from the development of modern British society, its creeds, and its institutions. Just for political balance, I've got Tony Blair, and I'll finish with him. In a much anticipated speech to the House of Commons that was designed to set the tone for the British government's celebration of the bicentennial of the Abolition Statute 2007, and, so I understand it, briefed by one of his ministers who was at the Durban conference, Blair expressed, quote, "deep sorrow about British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, famously stopping short of a full apology for slavery to avoid accepting official responsibility and opening up the British state to a claim for reparations." He deployed, however, a modicum of reflection to begin the long process of atonement. He wondered why it was that the slave trade emerged at a time when, quote, the capitals of Europe and America championed the enlightenment of man. Rather than confront this well-posed conundrum head-on, however, Blair was quick to retreat into a familiar truism and rush to the defense of modernity. Racism, not the rights of man, drove the horrors of the triangular slave trade. Racism has a central role, but modernity and the liberal political institutions and ideologies that define it belie this defense, as we have seen, especially those features of modernity connected to British identity. Quote, the rights of man, or their more elastic substitute freedom, contributed much to the escalation of the slave trade. And these values and ideals, as we have seen, operated in a distinctive way within the project to develop the British brand. Although they shape and are shaped by their historic contexts, values and ideals have intergenerational significance and culpability. Such values, especially when invoked in the service of the potent currency of national feeling, ought to be open to interrogation. Indeed, national self-interrogation of values across time is central to the realization of a free society and is a primary function of the professional study of history. The idea of freedom is, of course, adaptable enough to be rehabilitated, and the determinants of British national identity can be altered through education, through politics, through culture, and through the study and discussion of the past. These activities are, in a small way, beginning points for reparative conversations. Freedom's role in helping to end slavery is therefore only the beginning of the long process of repaying freedom's peculiarly British debt. Placing freedom's debt to the enslaved into the story of the emergence of modern British society represents another part of the continuing reconciliation and reckoning with the sins of the past. Liberal ideas, whether in their British settings or not, can't achieve their ambitions until their strange historic careers are broadly understood. Only once this broad understanding has been established can we hope to formulate a national British accommodation with slavery, and only then can the international features of reconciliation proceed. Politicians use history to build British identity, but triumphalist and misleading accounts of history prevent politics from forming an inspirational, hopeful bridge between the sins of the past and the restoration of the damaging legacies of those sins in the present. Freedom should be a part of British national pride, but before it can be so, it needs to pay the debt to the black victims of slavery by ensuring that racial discrimination has no part to play in British life. Thank you.
Is mine? Good morning. I would like to thank Professor Wesley for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Intellectuals and engaged scholars, a network are very important, and also circulation of ideas and actions also are very important. It's a coherent panel, I think, this morning, because it's very interesting to see how national identities or construct identity around slavery are different from a country to another. For Great Britain, it's the abolition of slavery and freedom around the world. And for France, it's a republic, which is a key concept. And I will talk about this morning. I have to say that I will speak as an historian, engaged. Alors, I don't know if it's the equivalent of engagé, Anna, Lucia, engaged? Or you're not sure? Okay. So, historian engagé, also in the memory of slavery. And but I will start with a citation first. In October 12, 2012, in France, in the newspaper Le Monde, intellectuals and politicians signed a paper which was a call for a national debate on reparation related to slavery, which began with the statement that, quote, in France, reparation related to slavery remain a taboo subject. They pursued asking for new actions and policies to respond to the legacy of colonial slavery, which is anti-black racism, discrimination, and inequality. In this text, they linked past and present, and in this presentation, I will do the same. I will present the constitutive elements of the debate on reparation, and will extend the same framework to think about it. It is especially a good time to talk about these questions because this year is the 170th anniversary of the second abolition in France, and it's also the 168th anniversary of the payment of indemnities to the slave owners. At the first level, reparations were viewed as financial indemnities, called sometimes compensation or redressment, without any moral consideration. This was before 1848, and it was out of the Atlantic context. In a second level, in 1848, and I have to say 1848 is the date of the year of the abolition, the second abolition of slavery in France. In a second level, in 1848, the moral consideration was included into the debate around slave, defined as a victim of slavery. But in the same time, they denied to the slaves the right to be beneficiary of indemnity. These will be my first 2 points, and I will link them to contemporary situation in a third point. I have to say that this presentation is part of a larger program financed by the French National Research Agency entitled Reparations, Compensation and Indemnities for Slavery, Europe, Americas and Africa, from the 19th to the 21st century. And it is conducted by a multidisciplinary group of researchers, historians, anthropologists, lawyers, and philosophers. And it is the first entire program completely dedicated to this subject in France. So it's really a work in progress that I will present you, and that's it's my part of the job in the large program. So my first point will be the debate of the abolition of slavery in the French Empire before 1848, because the question of reparation and indemnities is indeed an imperial question and has to be replaced in the French Empire. But I will start with an exception, which is the first point. So the first point is an exception in the French Empire and in the entire Atlantic. It is the abolition of slavery by the former slaves themselves in Saint-Domingue, Haiti. As you know, Saint-Domingue proclaimed its independence from France in 1804 and had to negotiate in 1825 its recognition as a sovereign state against compensation for the property of the French settlers. It was 90 million francs, gold francs, paid by the Haitian state between 1825 and 1880, and destabilized for long years the economy of the country. The second point is Mayotte. Mayotte is an island in the Indian Ocean, and who became a French colony in 1843. And in a decree passed on October 21st, 1845, Louis-Philippe, King of France, decided that the system of allocation of agricultural concessions must be free. So in this way, it was necessary to abolish slavery. And this abolition of slavery was in December 1846. Slavery was so abolished in the colony of Mayotte. Salary was given to former slaves. Indemnities were given to former masters with strategies that I will not describe here for strategies of the masters and former slave around this question. My third point will be Senegal. Because on January 23rd, 1844, the governor, Villomez, because of the British abolitionist campaign around the slave trade, conducted a survey about slavery. The objective was to abolish slavery, and you see we were in 1848. So it was a survey about slavery to abolish slavery, and they took quite a long time to write the ordinance, and they decide in the process that they will give an indemnity for masters equal to 4 million francs. But this abolition was supposed to take place in 1849. Did not appear because the abolition was anticipated because of the revolution of 1848 in France, who abolished slavery in all French colony. The indemnity, what is interesting in the Senegal case is that indemnities were not only for the property of enslaved people, but also concern the indentured labor engagé à temps in Senegal. But it's true that in the repartition of the indemnities, it's more the European people who gain indemnities than the Senegalese. So before 1848, there was really a real different policy in each peripheral colony, but the principle of indemnity has to be inscribed in the long history of indemnities by the French state. When the responsibility of the states was established, the state gave indemnities. You say 10 minutes? Okay. Okay. It was the case during the French Revolution, what was called the milliard des émigrés, and it was also the case after. But in the case of slavery, it was indemnity for the property of human being, and notion of injustice was precisely reintroduced along with the law. Debate about who has the right to gain indemnities between former enslaved and former master were key questions in the debate in 1848, linked to the acceptance of immediate and total abolition of slavery, which was the case in 1848. So my second point is precisely the abolition of slavery in 1848. And there are two levels in this question. The first one is the paradigm of the French Republic. In March 1848, the declaration of the Commission instituted to prepare the Act of Immediate Abolition of Slavery, conducted by Victor Schellcher, is solemn. It states that the Republic does not intend to make any distinction in the human family. The Republic does not believe that it is enough to glorify itself of being free people, to silence a whole class of men held out of the common law of humanity. The Republic took her principle seriously. It repairs to the poor people the crime which formerly robbed them of their lands by giving to them France as their country and to give them all the rights of a French citizen. Hence, it shows that the Republic does not include anyone from its immortal motto, liberty, equality, and fraternity. A month later, on April 1848, on this ground, slavery was abolished in all the French colony, and the abolition was explained as a form of a great act of reparation for a crime against humanity. It was in the law. And the reparation was also a great crime of France to humanity. So the old colonies become French departments, and with different process, which was the attribution of a name to former slaves, and also the establishment of a universal vote for male only in all the French colonies. That was a formal declaration because Republic, in fact, contains in itself the facts of inequality, especially on the fact that in the definition of the identity of what is a French person, the French person was defined as a mixed origin, but mixed of white race only, which give you a kind of what is a national identity at this time. On the question of identity, the jurists of the Second Republic in France established by decree the principle of the payment of an indemnity of 126 million francs to the owners of slaves of all the French colonies, as I say, Guadeloupe, Guyana, Martinique, Senegal, Réunion, Nosy Be, and Sainte Marie Island in the Indian Ocean. And they set up a moral controversy that opens as early as 1848. It tends to emphasize the unequal treatment between masters and slaves, what Schellcher will denounce, saying that I thought it was appropriate for the respect of the principle, the Republican principle, to call compensation and not indemnity. Compensation because the word indemnity responds to the disposition of a legitimate things, while there was to liquidate a purely legal thing. But despite this fact, it is a term of indemnity who was used by the Commission of the Abolition of Slavery. And it's interesting to say that it was a category of owners who was important, and there was no racialized category in this. In April 1849, the amount of the indemnity is fixed of 126 millions, as I say, and it is decided that 6 millions in francs were to be directly given to the owner of slave. And after that, there was 6 millions of an annual rental, that is to say 5% of a capital of 120 million francs. And Article 7 of the law indicates that the 8th part of the rental will be taken to create a loan bank in each colony to guarantee the bank notes that the colonies were authorized to produce. Colonial banks in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Guyana and La Réunion were created actually in 1845. And in the eyes of Victor Schellsche, it was a way to organize peasant property, which did not appear really. The second level of this question of 1848 is how these declarations were applied in the Atlantic French colony. The demands of former enslaved people were really justice. Two main demands, they formulate two main demands, and each indicated the meaning of freedom and citizenship for the new freedmen. The first concerned the ownership of the land and small cabins on the plantation in the name of the right of use and habits established during the period of slavery. The second concern was a demand of salary, which will make it possible to leave the dependency of the old master. There is really a good appropriation of citizenship in space relevant to the new freedmen. And it's important to note that the memory of slavery is not an obstacle to the exercise of freedom. However, equality between citizens faced civilizational and racial implicities. The former slaves were confined to obscurantism, and all their claims declared illegitimate by the Republic because of the opposition of how do you say that, the positive right and the right of use. Okay, so the equalitarian utopia of 1848 did not flourish. Overall, the differences in standard of living between the metropolis and Caribbean society, characterized by poor health and economic condition, persist through the 20th century. And the definition and all the Caribbean people were put aside of the national we, despite the law of departmentalization in 1848, which include the former colony into the French territory. These elements explain why the law of the 21st May 2001, known as the Taubira Law, declaring slavery and the transatlantic slave in the Atlantic and in the French Ocean as a crime against humanity, was a reconnection process in the term of Paul Ricoeur, and opened up a debate on citizens' equality. And I will conclude on this point. The question of reparation addresses the issue of the maintain in the contemporary societies of social, racial, and hierarchical relationship inherent from slavery. The measures of compensation for the former masters and not for former slaves address the effectivity of the way out of slavery and the effectivity of the abolition of slavery. The mobilization of the past he used to ask a new form of citizenship, and he used to denounce racism and social discrimination. And because my time is out, and without any continuity of my words, I would like only to cite Aimé Césaire, who is a Martinican poet and Martinican statesman, who said, and I will say in French and I will translate it after in English. Le terme de réparation implique qu'il puisse y avoir réparation. Or, c'est irréparable. Je connais suffisamment les Occidentaux. Ils vont dire, alors, mon cher, combien? Alors, top là, maintenant, c'est fini. In a very free translation, I will say, Aimé Césaire say, the word reparations means that there can be reparation, but it is irreparable. I know enough the Westerners. They will say, so my dear, how much? So, top, we make this deal. Now it's over. And I will finish this with this.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Nice to see you all. So thank you, Professor Robert Wesley and team for, the clicker, for organizing this conference. And thank you also, Professor, for your kind words. And you brought me an idea. I think it's a great suggestion to map in the US as well. So I think it's actually got me thinking immediately. Thank you also, Jake, for tracking me down, actually, and finding me. And the GAM family, of course, for being such a nice sponsor also to this meeting. So I was asked to talk specifically about mapping slavery. And I want to actually also contextualize it a little bit, because I'm going to talk about the Netherlands. And I'm not assuming that you know a lot about the Netherlands. You might, but so I want to, let me see if it works. Yes. So I want to talk a little bit about the Dutch historical context, also talk a little bit about Dutch reparation cases, just to give you an idea what's happening and what's not happening, because there's nothing happening on well, nothing is a little bit overstated, but there's not a lot happening on reparation in the Netherlands concerning the history of slavery. And so I'll end with explaining a little bit about mapping slavery itself. Okay. So, we had a wonderful map of the German colonial empire yesterday, so I thought I'd show you the Dutch colonial empire, because it's kind of big. And this is sort of a time span of, I'd say, 350 to 400 years of colonial rule of the Dutch around the globe, actually. And you can see the light green and the dark green spots are actually divided upon the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, who covered places, from South Africa to the Dutch East Indies, but also Taiwan, parts of the West African coast, the Gold Coast, Brazil, we've heard about that yesterday, but also, of course, North America and New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. And so, very differently, it worked obviously very differently for us as it did for other European countries, that we sort of outsourced our colonialism. So we didn't have plantations in the Netherlands proper, right? The metropole was exempt from that. So it happened everywhere else, basically. And the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie in Dutch, so the East India Company, was set up in 1602. It's now been seen as sort of the first multinational. It operated as a state within a state and operated in Asia and the Pacific and South Africa. So the East India Company and the West India Company sort of divided up the world. So their chart included the right to wage war, to conduct negotiation with foreign powers, and you can also see it in the VOC personnel that a lot of people were military and administrators. And they were seen as a driving force for technological and financial innovation. And up to this day, the Dutch really also have a strong sense of pride when we talk about the VOC. We have this VOC mentality, and prime ministers have been talking about this, and then they, talk about a good thing, actually. So 19 years later, the West India Company was set up through the format of the VOC, actually, which then operated in Western Africa and the Americas. A similar charter, which also meant that they were warring a lot with Spain and Portugal and competing a lot with the English. And obviously, the West India Company was very much involved in the transatlantic slave trade and has a reputation which is much worse than the VOC. And actually, in 2021, we will commemorate its 400th birthday. And if we look now at the Dutch post-colonial community in the 21st century, it kind of consists of 6.3 of the current Dutch population, which is the first and the second generation. It contains 50% of ethnic minorities in the Netherlands, and when people with a post-colonial background arrived in the Netherlands, 90% already was Dutch-speaking, very similar also to other European countries. And it's a very heterogeneous group in terms of ethnicity, class, education, and cultural background. Now, if we look at the history of slavery, it's important it's something that historians talk about a lot, but it's not been something that is really common in Dutch public education or just the public sphere at large. And for the longest time, we've actually connected slavery to American history and not Dutch history. So I want to share this quote with you from scholar Jones, who wrote, "With the realization of the National Monument of Dutch Slavery Heritage in 2002 and the installation of the National Institute for the Study of Dutch Slavery and its legacy in 2003, its descendants, those who remember, succeeded in making slavery a public issue. This development was preceded by a prolonged period in which the study of the history of Dutch slavery was non-existent in the Dutch memorial and memory landscape. Although for decades a specialized historiography on slavery and slave trade had been developed, this was not considered part of the Dutch historical canon and had little societal impact. Slavery in the Dutch education was associated before the year 2000 with the USA and Uncle Tom's Cabin, while around the Dutch history of slavery, a deafening silence could be heard." And so, the lobby of grassroots local organizations for people from descendant communities lobbied for monuments to be erected in the Dutch landscape. So in 2002, so this year, 16 years ago, the National Monument for the History of Slavery was established in Amsterdam. Although it's called a national monument, we did some research 6 months ago. So the larger part of the Dutch community does not empathize still with this history, so they don't consider it their national monument per se, right? But having that monument installed in Amsterdam did spur other communities, local communities, to set up similar monuments, one in Middelburg and in Rotterdam. Continuing this Dutch context, it's important to also note that we are right now in the middle of a quite difficult race debate, as it were. The Dutch, for the longest time, did not believe that race was a Dutch thing. We do not do race. And we're post-race. We're so beyond that. Yeah. So especially after World War II, that sort of was this idea was installed both in academia and in the public sphere. So for some activists and artists, also visual artists, were very much part of this conversation, to come out and actually denounce our blackface tradition, Black Pete, in 2011 was really rocking the boat in a tremendous way, which then spurred a second wave anti-racist movement. And I see Professor Shepherd smiling in the audience because she knows everything about how that works in the Dutch dynamics, because when she was speaking out on this issue in the Netherlands, I think that was 4 or 5 years ago, she still receives hate mail from the Netherlands and had to sort of close one of her email accounts because of it. Nevertheless, people have been pushing, and it's a multi-generational movement of black and white people alike, activists, lobbyists, researchers, and academics. And 2 seminal books came out just recently, Dutch Racism and White Innocence, and I want to point them out. They're both written in English, so they're accessible for you. Oh, what's happening? Oh, yeah. So characteristics of Dutch racism, as the 2 writers, Isabel Hoving and Philomena Essede, are talking about, are very much, a form of smug ignorance. We don't want to, we don't know, and we don't want to know. And so this is a very dominant discourse, and also equating it to a sense of innocence. So not wanting to, basically get into the case, which is obviously not unique for the Netherlands, but we do it in our own specific way. And then 2 years later, Gloria Wekker came out with this book of Dutch, White Innocence, where she writes an ethnography on the Dutch white landscape, and also, basically tries to figure out why is it that we don't talk about this colonial era while we're sort of been engaged in a colonial empire for so many centuries. Again, a lot of uproar, but also a lot of accolades for her work, actually, which is ironic because she's been working on this for more than 20 years, and now that she is retired, actually, people are starting to notice, kind of. Okay. My second point I want to briefly talk about is, as an introduction still, I only have 10 minutes left, is the reparations cases that we've been involved in. Our most successful one is actually the Jewish case related to World War II, which resulted in a settlement in 2000 after direct negotiations with financial institutions and the Dutch government by a group of a Jewish network. And in the European case, which was partly resolved after negotiations with the Dutch government and the Sinti Roma as well. So the Indo-Europeans and the Sinti Romas were sort of in the slipstream of the Jewish case, were also being awarded. Interestingly enough, our sort of only thing that is working right now is the Indonesian case. So a Dutch colonial war ensued in 1945, which led a series of ongoing court cases to be done between 2009 and 2015. 3 of those court cases were won, and in those court cases was actually the first time that the Dutch apologized for something related to colonialism. And so if you look at the slavery, the case of reparations and slavery, that's definitely not a very alive debate or lobby right now. And so these are some of the actors involved in those different reparation debates, with Lisbeth Zegveld and Jeffrey Pondaag being a very successful duo doing those Indonesian cases. Okay, I have to move on in terms of time, because I now want to go to mapping slavery itself, which started in 2013, but was preceded by a small working group at the University of Free University in Amsterdam, conducted by Dr. Dien Hondius, who's a historian, who was sort of jumping on its own, who was doing research basically about who was compensated as slave owners in Amsterdam in 1863. This was sort of just before 2013 ensued, which was the 150th anniversary of and commemoration of the history of slavery. And easily this group of students came up with 80 addresses in our famous canal district in the city center. And obviously it was picked up by the news right away. So these are all people who after 1863 were compensated. So people who had Surinamese enslaved people got, I think, 300 guilders per enslaved person. In case of Curaçao, I think it was 200. So yeah, in a lot of cases, they basically got a lot of money. So this is why we thought, well, let's start our Mapping Slavery project. It's a public history project. It focuses on the intersections of the past and the material, and these are some of the questions that we ask. So who were these people benefiting from slavery in the Dutch metropole and colonies? Where did they actually live and decide about investments? What traces of slavery enslavement can we still find in the Netherlands? And what black presence was there also in the Netherlands and Europe at large? And this is a little bit how we work. So we describe locations in the immediate living environment in the Netherlands and the former colonies. We standardize it in a database and convert it to digital and physical maps. So really visualizing this knowledge and making it really sort of tangible and concrete for a larger audience. This is also an ideal base for a variety of educational products. It could be walking tours, it could be publications, it could be educational modules, it could be exhibits, etc. But we're also very much, we also very much want to link networks. So we're all over the place, we're scattered around. There's also a lot of researchers in the Netherlands actually working outside of academia on this topic. A lot of it has to do with family history also. And we see that a lot of students, young people, are coming to us to actually help us out with our work, which we really, are happy with. So, but we're really also in the business of, trying to create a transnational interdisciplinary community, which we think is why we're so happy that we're here. So these are some of the sources that we work with. So obviously written sources, but also material sources, so museums, historical sites, objects and paintings. Case in point, when you have to do a lot of counter reading in the archives, because how can you, for instance, find enslaved people in those archives? It's very hard. There's these snippets of information. So sometimes also the visual archive helps us out. For instance, the famous painter Rembrandt painted 24 paintings with black people in them. Now, why did he do that? He wasn't the big traveler. And apparently this was actually him painting his neighbors and people in the vicinity, which then led us to this uncover, or mostly Dr. Dien Hondius did, and now Mark Ponte is working through that there was actually a black community already living in Amsterdam in the 17th century. And so we're now trying to unpack that history much more and going back to the archive, and now we know where to look, right? So this is how interdisciplinary work also really helps us forward in great ways. Also reading the city as an archive, so the streets. The Dutch are very famous, especially Amsterdam, for its gable stones. So there's hundreds of gable stones that actually refer also to black presence, trade, slavery, etc., etc. So really, stepping through the city and starting to read what are on these houses. A lot of 17th century houses are obviously still there. But also immaterial sources like cultural expressions, songs, et cetera, and family history. So people themselves, also because of 2013, which was the abolishment of slavery, like I said, then people were triggered to look into their own family histories in ways that they hadn't before. So that also helped us tremendously in unpacking this further and further. And these are some of our partners that were involved, that work with us, and internationally, for instance, because we've been mapping New York, we also have a lot of New York partners, and Brown University is a partner of ours. We also work with Professor Catherine Hall and her wonderful team, who've been doing excellent work, and you should check this website because it has a wonderful database with slave ownership in the UK and the Caribbean, and they're now in their third term of doing research. How am I doing for time? I still have a couple of minutes. Oh, okay. Yes. So, you what? Yeah. Okay. So these sources of inspiration are important to us. Catherine Hall and her team have shown us the importance of visualizing information and bringing it also close to home. It happened in my hometown too, this realization, and that it was a widespread system. It was of economic importance and based on sound research, but then shown in a very accessible way. Cosmopolis Utrecht, a cultural organization that I was part of, taught us also why it is important to create sustainable products for a general public, and also in terms of content, connect the transatlantic slave trade and the WIC story with the VOC and the Indian Ocean, because in our case in the Netherlands, definitely we are talking about similar numbers of enslaved people that were being forcibly traded and migrated because of the system at hand. Also looking at a broader perspective, so not just slave traders and slave owners, but also obviously the enslaved themselves or free black people that were also living in the Netherlands. Abolitionists, because as opposed to UK, we didn't have a mass movement of abolitionism, but there were pockets of resistance at the time itself. So these are some of the results thus far, and we're still working on it. These are some of the maps. I'll just briefly show you the New York map that we've worked on. As you know, Brooklyn, Harlem, Staten Island, the Bronx, they're all Dutch words, right, that have been Americanized. People like Sojourner Truth and Saartje Baartman were women who, as children, spoke fluent Dutch. Apartheid is the most famous Dutch word, you know. We're not proud of it, but there you have it. So we still have a lot of work to do. Thank you. Questions are for all of us.
Thank you for such rich presentations. Thank you for such rich presentations. I just wanted to sort of add to particularly the connection of development of common law and against the backdrop of slavery. One thing that we may want to register is, to the extent that we were yesterday talking about, you know, the uniqueness or otherwise of slavery in the Americas and North America, to the extent that perhaps one thing that makes it unique is the scale of slave labor's deployment as a factor of production as opposed to other places. So coming to the abolition under common law in 1834, it may be interesting to note that it's precisely at a point where, as far as the British are concerned, an alternative supply of labor has emerged. Interestingly enough, at that time called cheaper than a slave. and this had to do with the indentured labor being opened up in India. So it's interesting that it brings back, which came up yesterday too, the global chessboard on which pieces turn. The other instance, again, the common law and international law coming together as to who was on which side of the idea of open seas and freedom of navigation. Common law taking the position of closed seas, and the Dutch starting the idea of open seas having to do with. So it's I think we forget. So I thought that was very poignant that you put that on the table. However, misreadings of what genesis and operations of the law are, and how, particularly when we talk about where to turn for a remedy. So that I think puts us. So I just wanted to put and the French one, and I think when I learned about it, I was fascinated. So I think perhaps others would be too. Again, this the uniqueness, as it were, of the Americas as a factor of production. The word capitalism. The use of the word capital as in a dominant factor of production comes and originates from French Antilles in the late 18th century. So it's interesting that capitalism now underscores that, that means wage labor. And the very genesis is slave labor, and that's where even the term has been applied first time to that. So I think it was appropriate to drop that on the table with this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, may I add something? I'm not sure the translation of common law. What I mean, it's a positive law. Le droit positif was really opposed to the right of the use, the right of the use from the former slaves, who say we have the right to stay on the land because we were working on this land for years and years. So I'm not sure the translation of, do you use positive law? Yes, in droit positif. Do you know what it is?
Well,
okay. And about the indentured labors after the abolition of slavery, I would like to stress the fact that it was the first indentured labor in the Caribbean were Africans. And before the Indians coming to the Antilles. And it was it's a very interesting process, because it has to be linked with the notion of freedom and how you conceive freedom from the Westerners' eyes, because these African people were, most of them, slaves in Africa, and they were by the French administration. They were given freedom, and just after they have to sign a 7 years contract, was quite the same thing as slavery, even though the return was included into the contract, but it was a hopeless return because they don't have the money and things like this. So it's interesting to think how the capitalism, as you say, is really linked with this balance between slavery and free labor, and we could ask ourselves what does it mean, free labor, in this sense.
Insofar as the attitudes we've managed to make some significant strides in making changes in public attitudes with respect to cigarette smoking and LGBT acceptances and equality, and it's done with the benefit of public relations, marketing, and campaigns that understand how to change human personality and address grievances that people have. It seems like this question of why should people today have to pay for the sins of their parents, grandparents, and why should people who were be getting benefits because of crimes committed against their parents and grandparents? And I think that Sapolsky, in his recent book, Behavior, really points to the impact of how our ancestors were treated in terms of its current, how it affects our lives today. And it seems like there's an important role to be played in educating the public about the long-lasting intergenerational impact of what slavery did to those people who suffered slavery upon their children and on their grandchildren. And that seems to me a major selling point that that the public needs to be more aware of, that in terms of understanding that there's a legitimacy and reparation, even for those, even though it benefits those who were not directly the recipients of the cruelty of slavery, and the whole panoply of how slavery impacted how families were broken up and were and they were undermined in terms of educating their children about healthy family life and the important role that is necessary for a fulfilling life to prepare for jobs and all the things that are necessary for a full and fulfilling life. So I guess my question is just, has there been any examination by a group of people to come up with a strategy to better inform the public about the legitimacy of reparation for future generations, those who were not the descendants of those who were slaves?
There's more questions for you.
It's a different, huh?
It's for you.
It's for me. Well, I've done, as it so happens, I did some research on the Jewish case and how the media has done coverage on the Jewish case. And there you see a long sort of process of, because in the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, nobody cared about the Jewish case in terms of the Holocaust. People were talking about the resistance movement, the Dutch resistance movement, and that was it. And what you see with this media coverage, that in the 80s, it started also with, speaking on trauma. So in the beginning, a lot of people were speaking about trauma issues. So psychiatrists were speaking on this issue. Then popular culture kicked in, and there were movies made that had larger audience. So you see, phases where, public awareness seems to shift because of a couple of, domains that start to pitch in a sense. And but to answer your concrete question, I'm not sure in the Dutch case if people have been doing research on that, but in a sort of concise way. But there is, for instance, at University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht, Nicole Imler is trying to do a comparative research between reparations cases in the Netherlands that are taking place. But I think, we should really get more in depth about that, because I think you're right, the strategy is not there yet. I don't know how that, but the UK has a very strong reparations grassroots movement, actually. So I don't know if you can speak to that, but I do know that they're working on that. And I don't know about France,
Yes,
but yeah,
yes,
Miriam, maybe you can add.
yes, there are different movements in France, but you have to consider France from the continental perspective of France and the overseas department. And there are movement of what is called self-reparation, for example, in Martinique and Guadeloupe, where grassroots people do what they think it's good for them as reparation. And I give you an example. In 1982, there was a judgment of Christophe Colomb. It was organized by a political organization who judged Christophe Colomb for what he did and was it good and it was called self-reparation. And Christophe Colomb at the end, it was in Martinique, Christophe Colomb at the end was had to give 1 franc, so it was not heavy judgment, but the discussion was part of what was called reparation. And there are others. There is a Mouvement International des Reparations, International Movement of Reparation, who've made land occupancies in Martinique, and also who sue Beckles, which is a colonist descendants of slave owners, Hugues Despointes, who in a film, in a movie, was performed by French TV, describe how wrong was the miscegenation of race, and he was sued by the French state. It's another kind of another level of the question, but the French state put him on a process because it was called, there are different memorial law connecting slavery and also the memory of the Shoah in France. And there is a law called Loi Guesso, who is, of course, against the promotion of the purity of blood and race. And because of this law, Loi Guesso, the state sues this man, who was not condemned at the end. It's a long story. So there are really different cases of grassroots reparation. There is another one of different persons who, based on their genealogy, and when they discover their slave ancestor, they sue the French state because slavery is a crime against humanity in the terms of Le Lobira law. So they took this law and they ask reparation for their former ancestors. So there are different levels in this question.
I have one comment to Miriam, clarification, and then two questions to all of you. Miriam, the issue of the Asian compensation, I think that you mentioned 90 million francs, and this is 150 million. Mm-hmm. The question that I would have is that you have a mention also that the abolition of 1848, that in the text of the law there was this idea of crime, the term crime against humanity, but indeed it's not crime. What is sort of attack on human dignity. Oui, yes. Attentat contre la dignité humaine.
Yes, but there is also crime.
The yes. Text of the law has the word crime? Crime against humanity?
No, it's a crime de lèse-humanité. It was in the French Commission of preparing the law of the abolition.
Okay, not in the text of the law the text of the law. Then it's before that we have, because the law has the term attack, attentat à la dignité humaine. Okay, donc c'est ça. This is what I wanted to know.
The notion of crime is in the debate, and
In
it's
the debate.
It's put in the debate.
Okay.
It's a well. Okay, I will.
No. I let you respond that because I had because this would be the first time. Then there is a lot of discussion on when this term first appeared. And there are some historians of the Caribbean now, for example, bringing this up to the period of the Haitian Revolution, when Christophe and others would have brought that term. And I always have the idea that it was by 1848. Some people, they say that the idea comes as early as the beginning of the 19th century. And this is a question that I had, because the law of 1848, what I had, it was attentat contre la dignité humaine. But you clarified. Now, the other question that you already brought in terms of the question, and this would be a question for all of you. You mentioned the kind of movements that you see in France regarding the issue of reparations, but with a number of initiatives that look like more symbolic reparations. But I saw some elements, but very lightly like this, perhaps in the last months, in terms of financial and material compensations, where we are about this issue in France. Like not only the issue, of course, that there were symbolic reparations in many ways. You brought some of these elements. Then I would like to know about this. And then to you both, I would have then to Nancy and Dr. Pettigrew, because I forgot your first name. Go. William. Sorry, William and Nancy. Then the question would be, in terms of the British case, I ask myself, because your talk remain much on all the debate of Britain being the greatest defender, supporter of abolition. And then you came up to Tony Blair, but Tony Blair is already those alleged apologies. This is more than a decade old. And I ask myself where we are now in Britain in terms of these demands of reparations. I think that Nancy asked the same question, especially because in Britain, as you are having in France, and Miriam perhaps can talk about it as well, this how is the name? British slave ownership project, and whether this is having an impact on grassroots movements, if you want to call them that way, requesting financial reparations. I don't know if in the case of the Dutch we have anything on that, but I believe that I ask myself if there is any kind of influence of what is happening in these other countries. But I would like to know about financial reparations, where we are in the cases that you are studying.
Thanks. I mean, clearly our next session will be about the British case, and I don't want to say too much about to preempt what Professor Sir Hilary is going to say about the British case. He has more up-to-date information than me. Certainly the UCL project, which I know very well, and in fact I'm going to be heavily involved with in its next stage, has done a lot of work in trying to develop this idea of reparative history to create networks of academics. But as to whether or not their database infrastructure has been able to successfully gather a grassroots movement, I don't think so. Indeed, there's sort of profound reticence amongst academics as well. So I think I would have to be very clear. I mean, certainly politicians, government ministers are profoundly skeptical, and I don't see any huge progress on the issue of financial reparations in Britain.
But I think we also have to be clear that it takes a while. I mean, the Jewish case. No, I know. But what you see, yeah.
If people are demanding, the point here is not to ask ourselves, this is going to happen tomorrow, next year, in 10 years, or is going to happen at all. Just want to know if where we are in terms of demanding, because the slave ownership project had an impact even among the academics.
Well, what you see is that David Olusoga, who works at the BBC, has done a two-part series based on the work of Catherine Hall and her team, and did a wonderful documentary series. And I think those are the instances that are needed. I mean, you know, people like Esther Sosai in Britain and all the other grassroots. I mean, they're really, you know, the 10-point plan that CARICOM has, they already also formulated all types of issues that they want to put on the table. And I think those issues were both symbolic and financial, right?
I mean, Olusoga's program doesn't mention reparations at all. I mean, in that sense, it's an opportunity missed. Because that was on primetime TV. I don't know what David's opinion on the reparations issue is. The debate now is gravitating towards memorialization, going back to what you were saying yesterday, especially about statues and you know, the cultural representations. That's a more live concern, at least among the population at large. Yeah.
But in the case of Suriname, Armand Zander has written a couple of years ago already a book where he actually really talks about the numbers. He actually gives numbers on how much should be compensated in reparations, and this is obviously the Dutch case. But those types of numbers haven't necessarily been produced in the Netherlands proper, per se. Perhaps maybe by Beryl Beekman, but that I wouldn't know of. Yeah. But Armand Zunder's work is in that respect quite helpful.
Yes, all the case I was talking about were also a way to gain financial reparation, and all this case, and there is one point, and there is also the CRAN, which is the Conseil de représentatif des associations noires in France, who ask for that the French state reimburse Haiti. And that was one of the main fight. So the financial reparation, yes, is on the table, but it's true that the choice of the French states were more symbolic. And after the Taubira law, and it's interesting to see that in the Taubira law, in the first text, there was a chapter on reparation and financial reparation, and it was taken out before the vote by the French Assembly. But the Taubira law is presented also as a symbolic reparation law, especially because it creates a national commemoration day in France around the abolition of slavery, which is the 10th of May. It creates also the National Committee for History and Memory of Slavery, which is a council to the government on action around the question of slavery and post-slavery, meaning racial discrimination, racism. And also, because of the Taubira law, all the French schools at 2 levels have to be taught on the question of slavery, and more or less more Atlantic slavery. So it's because France is a centralized country, so the minister decide of the curriculum of the student, and that's point. And I say it nicely because it's a kind of long fight, but now it is into the curriculum of the students. And there are different action, but it's true that all the time it's symbolic. There was a presentation yesterday morning about François Hollande and his declaration and there are a lot of things to say around his declaration, but it's true that after at the end, he was pushing symbolic reparation and do not consider any other option.
Okay, my question is very simple. I very much enjoyed your presentation, Nancy, and I'm just wondering if there are any voluntary moral reparation cases due to the pressure of your mapping project. In the fields of the looted art, at some museum, the list of looted art made public, and some pictures have been, as you know, returned to Jewish families. So, could you respond?
Yeah, but
Simple question.
Yeah, but in the case of that happened, and well, what's interesting now is that there's a debate starting on obtaining the way colonial products and of colonial artifacts were being obtained, and that they should be returned. So in a sense, this material culture attached to a reparations debate, that is something that is starting actually now. But in the case of, there's still court cases pending in terms of looted art in the Jewish case, but
Reparation from the descendants of the slave owners.
yeah.
To the
Well, I mean that there's no public pressure felt at all at this moment, but I think it also has to do a little bit with people being wary. The Black community, in a way, riding this wave of anti-racism also in this debate and connected to current social issues, are also a little bit wary to, so when are we going to drop this notion of reparations and financial reparations? Because it might turn the conversation also for worse. I mean, that's also a little bit what I sense with people from when are you going to actually talk about it? Because we're now riding a different wave, kind of. But this notion of slave owners being compensated as opposed to enslaved, and that is a thing, that's not how people feel in the Netherlands. It's just not a thing at this moment, I wouldn't say. In the back, there were two gentlemen in the, yeah.
We're actually over time.
Yeah.
But we're going to take maybe a few more, and then we're going to break.
Okay.
This is just a brief question with regard to the actual terms. You said it was a crime contre la lésion humaine.
Crime de lèse-humanité.
De lèse-humanité.
De lèse-humanité.
Donc c'est comme.
C'est quand on enlève quelque chose à l'humanité, quand on crée un tort à l'humanité. And it was really the process how to think about the abolition of slavery. It begins with the unity of a human being, and that slavery was something fighting against the unity of humanity.
But this comes from the crimen lese majestatis, no? From initially the concept of insulting the rule of the king.
Sorry, I did not understand.
This is the sort of French Revolution development of the crimen lese majestatis.
Yes.
So this is not yet the crime against humanity. This is the sort of, might be one of the earlier forms of it, but it's still.
Well, it's the term of humanity, has evolved in its definition. I think so. It's not the same thing in 18th than in the 19th century, but I think there is an equivalent, really, between crime lèse-humanité and crime contre l'humanité.
Okay, thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I just want to say I hope we have Mr. Gam's comment on tape, because it would serve as an excellent epigraph for this special issue of the journal that will collect the papers, because I think it really is key to so much of what we're talking about, sort of explaining to people, you know, the significance of these seemingly long past events. I mean, how many times have people quoted Faulkner's comment about the past is not gone, it's not even past? But the sort of presentations you've made all kind of raise this question of how much is this the past and how much is it the present? And I think it's a very difficult sort of problem to address and to resolve, to say that these things may have happened, you know, a long time before you were born, before you arrived here or your people arrived here as immigrants. But we all face, you know, a certain problem, which is that some of our fellow citizens are being, you know, ill-treated. And as a result of, you know, things that took place a long time ago that were none of their doing, and perhaps none of yours, none of your families, et cetera. But, you know, I've said this yesterday, I think it's incredibly important that we think of this all as a, you know, a concern of ours as citizens in common. Otherwise, it just seems like somebody else's problem that took place long in the past that I had nothing to do with. So that's a kind of comment. And I mean, as you were all speaking, I was thinking about this whole question of how we think about the past and, you know, and its relationship to the present. And three sort of quotations occurred to me. I'm not going to get them all exactly right, but I think Burke, in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, says, men are heirs to the good that their countries do, but innocent of its crimes. It's not exactly what he says, but it's close. Karl Marx says, you know, men, human beings, make their history, but not just as they like, but under, you know, the terms of the past, and the traditions of all previous generations weigh like a nightmare on the minds of the living. And the third, I think, kind of splits the difference here, and that's Walter Benjamin. And when he says in these Theses on the Philosophy of History that, you know, basically there's all these crimes that pile up in front of the angel of, what he calls the angel of history, and the angel of history would like to sort of make whole what has been smashed, which is, of course, where I stole my title from for my book about reparations. But, you know, it's unable, the angel of history is unable to do this because he's blown backward by a storm. And that storm is what we call progress. So there's this question of how do we think about, this is too general a question. It doesn't have any specific answer, really. But it seems to me that these are very different ways of thinking about the past, and that we need to come to grips with that problem. And we also need, as a more practical political matter, to address this point that Mr. Gam has raised about how do we persuade people that, you know, people's current circumstances, as Marx suggests, are shaped by the past. Thank you.
Okay.
Just maybe quickly,
No,
can I
but
say,
please,
quickly say something? Just, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, I fully agree, but what I concretely notice in the case of the Netherlands, that people do relate to the past if they have affinity to it and empathize with people who are, feel the result, because of negative results of it. And there's no affinity nor empathy concerning the history of slavery in the Netherlands. And that's something that's really a process that needs to be developed, because it's very strongly there if you look at the Holocaust, the past of the Holocaust. So that's an interesting, huge difference in the case of the Netherlands.
Can I just very quickly? So I mean, there's one more quote that we might use, is revealingly from a slave owner who partially set up this country, who refused to free his slaves on his death, that the earth belongs to the living. Thomas Jefferson. So I think many of these statements are pretty self-seeking, and that's my point. My presentation is saying David Cameron can't praise Britain for abolishing the slave trade, and then say that slavery happened hundreds of years ago and that we can completely ignore it. It's the selective treatment of the
pick and
past
choose.
that is offensive and politically unsatisfactory, and it is being exposed.
Robert, a very quick comment, please.
Go ahead, Ty.
I strongly disagree with the premise of the comment being made. No, we are not talking about some misunderstanding between fellow citizens. For one thing, a part of within this country, rights of citizenships are at stake and have been. Two, it is a global problem. Half the living on this earth today are suffering from both its legacy and continuing percolation of this problem. So by suggesting, even after quoting Faulkner, that something we are talking about the past and it was just a minor misunderstanding, I think mischaracterizes the problem, and then we can't really face its implications and hope to even move towards addressing it. It's not something between fellow citizens, period.
True.
May I just say something?
Wait. I'm going to allow one more comment from the panel, and then we're going to have to go to break. We really do have to stop.
Yes, it's about the term of empathy. Empathy you talk about. I don't think there is no feeling in this question. I mean, it's history, and I will not say past. I will say it's history, and it's important to see how the history of slavery is really part of the world history and the national history, and what does it produce into the present. The past is it could be a nice link with it could be something completely dreamed or imagined, but history is another thing. History is to evaluate all the elements and to see how they connect together, how they form a system, and to include really the history of slavery into the history with the capital H. I think it's really an important thing, because we don't need a sentimental link with the history of slavery if we really want to evaluate the link to the present. We need to have a complete and stable and stabilized element to think about this. And this is history who could help us, and not a kind of romantical link to the past, I will say.
Let's thank the panel. Okay, so we're going to get started now. And I have to say that I'm very honored to have the opportunity to introduce Sir Hilary Beckles. Sir Hilary Beckles is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and Chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Committee. He's had a distinguished career as an academic, international thought leader, United Nations committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. In 2007, he received a knighthood, Commander Knight of St. Andrew, the highest national honor recognized in Barbados, in recognition of his distinguished service in the fields of education, sports, and the arts. And I really could go on and on with his accolades, but we don't have time. So without further ado, let's welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, Sir Hilary Beckles.
Thank you so very much, Robert, for your kind comments. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to join in this conversation. I wasn't able to be here on the first day, but what I have heard so far this morning is extremely exciting and very empowering indeed. I'm not going to say anything this morning that is new to any of you. I will just give you my sense as to where I am at in this conversation. It's a complex and dynamic situation, we all know, and we are all charting our individual paths through this. And some of us have institutional responsibility for allocating resources and shaping policy. We all have to figure out what role we're going to play in this movement. As an historian, I am guided by a paradigm which was rolled out in my presence by a 12-year-old child some 2 years ago, and a school conversation in Barbados. I was addressing these kids on the reparations issue, and at the end of it, we had a little workshop. And the smart kid just drew a pyramid and said, well, this is what we are building. We are building a pyramid, and we're close to the top. And she explained that this was consistent with our history as African people, largely because we are pyramid builders. And we set out to build pyramids knowing that it will take hundreds of years to complete them, and that no one generation will see the end of it. But you begin on a collective project knowing that it will be the responsibility of the generations, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, all the way through time to complete this work. We don't think like that anymore. Societies on the whole do not begin things that they cannot see the end of it. But earlier time, there was always a project that held the culture together. So I took that as my cue in framing my own comprehension of the reparations movement, that this is what we're doing. We've set out these past 500 years to do this. And I think all of the peoples, the African peoples, the indigenous peoples of the world, I think all of these communities upon whom modernity fell have been trying to excavate themselves from under it. And all of them have been contributing in their own ways to building this pyramid. The question of optimism versus pessimism is an interesting one. There is a view which is gaining ground that this time around we have traction, we have energy, and we're close to reaching the apex of this structure. There are others who believe that this is an effort in political futility. It might serve its individual purposes, but so this is the nature of our conversation. I think using the pyramid paradigm, I can say that it took us a good 200 to 300 years to get rid of chattel slavery. It was a long struggle. One of the conversations you will hear in many households today is that young black people are drifting because they no longer have a cause, and that in the entire period of slavery, every generation tried to get rid of it. And it was a collective cause that garnered an entire people, so that every generation, and there was no generation in this hemisphere, there was no generation of Africans in this hemisphere that did not launch a war to end slavery. Whether these wars were fought in the islands of the Caribbean, on the mainland of the US, Canada, Latin America, there wasn't a generation from the time Columbus arrived here to the end of the 19th century that there wasn't a major war to end slavery. And so we might very well define the 400-year period of slavery as a long civil war against the terrorism of it. So let's say, in terms of constitutional activity, it took all of the 19th century to get rid of slavery, from the sustainable Haitian situation of 1804 through to Brazil in the 1880s, but it took that long 100 years to legislate the removal of chattel slavery. And that's a long time. 100 years of legislation is a long time. And if you say then, it took us all of the 20th century then to get civil rights and so on embedded in constitutions in these post-colonial, post-slavery societies, another 100 years, another 100 years of struggle to get civil rights respected in the constitutions of these countries, still being denied in many places. And now we have this long 21st century ahead of us. We have this very long 21st century ahead of us. And in my judgment, the reparatory justice movement will shape this century. I think it's going to be the greatest political movement of this century. I think it's the movement that will unite, as I heard this morning, someone made reference to most of humanity trying to find its way out of this history. I think the gentleman spoke about that. And undoubtedly, the reparations movement has become a very large tent under which conversations are taking place about the search for justice against the context of the brutality of colonization that has been a global process. And when I listen to conversations in the Caribbean, when I listen to conversations in the Indian Parliament around how the British destroyed the Indian economy and set out to destroy the competitiveness of the Indian industrial sector in the 19th century, all of these stories, they're all connected. Whether it's the legacies of the East Indian Company, the West Indian Company, all of these issues are connected. Yes, and it is true that the African people did not suffer the worst end of this. It's the indigenous peoples of many of these societies that suffered the worst end of it. Many of them did not survive. In the Caribbean, 90% of the native population was wiped out. So the slavery, the enslavement of African peoples was crafted in the context of the genocide against millions of people. And in the scale of human criminality, I suppose we might agree that the genocide is the deepest end of the pit. And so when I wrote the book, Britain's Black Debt, and in the subtitle, I co-joined the concept of enslavement with genocide and spoke about the genocide of the native people of the Caribbean, who the British government had instructed the colonial administrators to destroy them. And we have the correspondence. It's not a matter of writing history backwards. We have the correspondence from the British government instructing the colonial governors to exterminate these people who have infected the islands. And that was a concept they used, infected, and were standing in the way of colonization. So when we compare the letters written by the British government to exterminate people from the planet, and we have those letters, and then we compare those letters with the letters written by the same British government to their agents and to their military in West Africa, that Chief X was standing in the way of the slave trade, and you're authorized to remove him. So you get it on both sides, coming from the same government to assassinate African leaders who were standing in the way of the slave trade, or to assassinate or to exterminate native peoples who were resisting colonization. So all of this we put together, and we realized that indeed it's a continuity. And I was very proud, when I first engaged the minutes surrounding why Dessalines of Haiti decided to rename the nation Haiti. He could have called it Little Nigeria. He could have called it Little Ghana. He could have called it anything. But he chose to reconnect the indigenous identity because, as he said, the African struggle was a continuation of the indigenous struggle. But the two relationships are co-joined because in the context of the Caribbean, chattel slavery was also genocidal. And I think this point is oftentimes subsumed, that if you consider that maybe less than 20% of the Africans who came into the Caribbean survive. And when we look at the demographics on the whole, the number of people, the number of Africans who were brought into the Caribbean by the European powers, the numbers who were brought there, and then you take the moment of emancipation. You take the moment of emancipation, and only about 20% of them had survived. So that in each island, only about less than 20%, in fact, of those who were brought represented the population. If you bring 1 million people into an island over 200 years, and at the end of 200 years, you have 150,000 people. How do you reduce 1 million people to 150,000 over 200 years? That is the classic definition of genocide. You create an environment and you take a people through a process that debilitates their capacity to reproduce and sustain themselves. That is genocide. And so when we speak of chattel slavery, it's important for us to add to it that we're also, in the context of the Caribbean, we're also speaking about genocide, the genocide of the African peoples. On the island where I was born, Barbados, which was the first colony where there was a sustainable African majority in the Atlantic world, or I should say probably in the East Atlantic world, the West Atlantic world. On the island of Barbados, the British brought 600,000 Africans. Over 211 years, 600,000 were imported. At emancipation in 1834-38, there were 83,000. Again, you reduce 600,000 to 83. The population today is 280,000. So, classic definitions again of the process of slavery as a process of genocide. Now, we heard a great deal, I heard a great deal this morning about the emancipation legislation and the acts of emancipation pushed through the various parliaments of Europe. These acts of legislation were arguably the most racist documents we have available to us in modernity. It is the case of all of them. All of the European acts of emancipation, they constitute monuments to racist and racialist thinking that establish the criminality of the act of slavery. And this is very simple. In all of these emancipation acts, the Europeans determined that they had to compensate, as you have heard, the enslavers, compensate their market value. That is, you carry out an actuarial assessment of the economic value of the Africans, and you compensate the owners at market value. But in order for the executive of government to instruct the Treasury to release those resources, the legislation had to argue very clearly that it is property compensation which is being paid. And to pay property compensation from the public treasury, you had to define the Africans as property. And so the legislation begins with a definition of Africans as non-human, as property, because the objective of the legislation is to pay property compensation. And to pay that property compensation at the contemporary value. The British case is doubly disgusting in the sense that the British had determined that their 600,000 Africans, 700,000 Africans who they had enslaved, in the Caribbean, they were worth, their market value was £47 million. They conducted their study, they did the accounting process and determined that their replacement value was £47 million. But they were not going to pay the slave owners $47 million. They determined that they would pay them $20 million. So if we're going to pay the slave owners $20 million, but we accept that they were worth, the replacement value was $47 million, how do we treat with the $27 million? The act was then structured and designed in such a way as to create a subsequent process where the Africans, after they were freed, would then have to work for free for another 8 years. And that is how they crafted the act. And then it moved from 8 to 6 to 4, but they were juggling with a period after emancipation where the enslaved would have to work off through an additional period of labor, the 27 million. And they calculated how long it would take to provide $27 million of free labor after emancipation, and that is how the act was structured. The result, therefore, was that the African peoples had to pay more for their emancipation than the compensation which was given by the government. So the slave owners got $28 million in cash, and they got $27 million in free labor after emancipation. And understand, these are entrepreneurs who are in a parliament structuring a piece of legislation. These are men, because most of the men in the British Parliament were slave owners. These were men who had been enriched using legislation to ensure that slavery worked as a financial system. And therefore, they were going to legislate to ensure that they extract their value out of the situation. And of course, they were supported by some of the finest economists available to them at the time. And John Stuart Mill, Ricardo, all of the great economists, all the classical economists from Adam Smith right through, were saying to them, listen, you have 47 million pounds of assets tied up in the Caribbean islands. And probably more. That doesn't include the buildings, the plantations themselves, the animals, the fixtures, all of that. So you have millions of assets tied up in these islands. But Britain needs you to repatriate that wealth home. Bring it home, because the industrial economy is now at its beginning. The railway technology is now developing. The cities, the towns are becoming cities. The industrial culture is maturing. There's a shortage of capital. You need to bring that capital out of those islands, bring that capital home and invest it. How do you legislate in such a way as to create a movement of capital from one part of an economy to another part of an economy because you believe there's greater value added? Okay? And there's also greater value added because now we are deepening our empire in Asia. India is now more important to us. East India is now more important than West India. And therefore we need the capital out of the West Indies to move into Britain and to move into India. And therefore this legislation is crafted in such a way by entrepreneurs who understood the globalization of capital and the process of industrial development. All of this is important. And I say this to emphasize that there is a mega narrative surrounding this conversation about slavery and emancipation and so on. There's a bigger narrative going on. There's a bigger discourse going on, a huge discourse about economic transformation of the modern world. This conversation is a part of it, just a part of it. But where are we? Where are we now? We have an interest in building a global movement around reparatory justice. And there are many people who, quite frankly, don't really care too much about whether white people are racist or not. I mean, that is not relevant. For many people, that is irrelevant. What is relevant is whether you can build a movement that creates a framework for people to live their lives as equal citizens. When Martin Luther King was developing the civil rights movement, he was concerned about whether black folks have education, have housing, can walk the streets, can have jobs. I think these were his concerns. Whether the people who had suffered the legacies of slavery and colonization, whether they could live their lives as normal citizens. I don't think he cared too much as to whether white people are racist or not. What goes on in their head is irrelevant. What is important is whether we can create a movement, build a framework of legislation that deepens democracy, that gives everyone an equal opportunity to live their lives and to be respected as equal citizens wherever they are living. And other folks who don't accept this, well, they can live in their own world. Because it doesn't matter whether if I go for a job, whether the person who's going to interview me, whether that person is a racist or not. What is important is when you look at my record, give me the job based upon my rights and my qualifications. And what you think about me and my skin color, that's your business. I'm not interested in that. My civil rights. So we are interested at the moment in building a global reparatory justice movement centered around this concept that a global crime has been committed, there has to be global justice, and this crime has to be repaired. And one of the reasons why I always accept invitations, well, I do my best, to speak in universities around this subject, as opposed to civil society, grassroots organizations, courts, tribunals, United Nations fora, is because the universities played a critical role in establishing slavery, consolidating slavery, and sustaining slavery. And to the extent that the university and academia, historians especially, academics, that our professions, our institutions, that we were so critical in building slavery and sustaining slavery, that therefore we have a role to play in this process of reparatory justice. I know that many universities today are looking into their own historical contributions to this process and are trying to work through their own methodologies of repair, and they're coming to terms with this because they have been told that they must come to terms with it. That academia was a site, a rich site for the enslavement of African peoples. To not only did universities own enslaved peoples, bought and sold them, used them as assets on their balance sheets, but universities also provided the intellectual and philosophical rationale for sustaining slavery. And the slave owners looked to academia to provide them with the tools to sustain the legitimacy of slavery. And that brings us as academics, as university persons, into the mainstream. A few years ago, when the powers of the Caribbean were determining whether they should appoint me as vice-chancellor of their university, there was a very powerful group of people who argued that they would support my nomination on condition that I remove myself from the reparatory justice movement. That this is not a process that a vice-chancellor of a university should be a central advocate. It doesn't put the university in good light. And that view was argued. And my view was that the university has to be the principal pillar on which this process rests, for both pedagogical reasons as for civil society consciousness-raising reasons. And certainly my university, the University of the West Indies, which is celebrating 70 years this year, was built for the explicit purpose of repairing the damage that has been done to African peoples. This is precisely why it was built in the first place. And in the second place, our three campuses, our three landed campuses, we have a fourth campus, an open campus, but our campuses in Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, all of these campuses were built on slave plantations, were physically built on slave plantations. So each day when we walk across our campuses, we are walking across land that was tilled by enslaved peoples. And from time to time, when we try to build buildings and put up structures and we dig up the foundations to put up a building, the bones are coming up from the ground, because the enslaved African peoples were just thrown into a hole somewhere. And then you would see these bones coming up. I mean, Professor Shepherd was on the Mona campus, found herself at the center of this when we were building a beautiful state-of-the-art medical faculty complex, and the contract was won by a Chinese company, and they brought the bulldozers in. And as the bulldozers began to tear up the ground for the foundation, they stumbled upon an African burial ground. All the bones came up from the ground, which forced Professor Shepherd then to do all of the right things, stop the thing for a while and do the right thing. But this happens all across the Caribbean. The entire Caribbean is a large cemetery to African peoples. It's a huge graveyard. Millions of people buried all over the place with no record. And these bodies are coming up from the ground all over the Caribbean. So let us talk about Britain's black debt within that context. A reference was made this morning to reparatory history. I was a part of the working class migration from the Caribbean to Britain, what I call the second triangular trade. We were brought from Africa to work on the plantations. Then after the war, the Second World War, Britain needs cheap labor. British economy is growing, expanding. They need cheap labor, another round of cheap labor, and thousands of people from the Caribbean and from India were brought over to Britain to do the cheap work. Work in the factories, work on the buses, the social services, the second round of that labor. Wherever they need cheap labor from the empire, they just move it around. They move it around. So my folks were a part of that, and I was caught up in it. And children are always caught up in these things. And this is why the whole study of child labor in slavery and in colonization is so important. And so my folks were caught up in the second round of Middle Passage labor to Britain to work in the industrial sector. So in my years in high school and subsequently surviving high school, which was a feat in itself, because the immigrant children were not meant to survive that. The immigrant children were seen as replacements for their fathers and mothers in the factories. We were supposed to follow our parents logically into the industrial factories. So you survive some of that, you break the cycle a little bit. But in those years, the history that was taught to us was hate history. I had 4 years of high school in British schools being exposed to hate history. The curriculum, the teaching, the language, it was hate history. It wasn't history. Then I go on to university and the same thing is there. The curriculum, a lot of hate history. Why? Because the school teachers and the professors were the gatekeepers of this crime. They were the ones who covered it up. Academia persistently covered up these issues. And so, yes, students are not exposed to the history that you might wish to discuss. But instead, they were given the glorification of the empire. They were given the hate history. They were given the hate history, the triumphalism of Britain, the triumphalism of the British aristocracy, the triumphalism of militarism, the celebration of genocide, the celebration of slavery, the iconic celebration of men who went around the world committing crimes and murdering and butchering people. These were the people who we were told to celebrate. Okay. So we had no respect for historians. I have never had any deep respect for historians because of my early scarring. So I became a historian because I wanted to fight back. It was an act of fighting back. And I remember once, if you take the book by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, which arguably is one of the finest books of history in the 20th century. And most of my professors thought it was a piece of tract, a propaganda tract. This was not scholarship. This is a diatribe for a magazine. And so the work, the historiography that tried to correct these issues was dismissed and pushed aside. The classroom was a war zone. The classroom was a war zone of empire. Yeah. So we are all guilty in all of this. And therefore the guilt of the university and the guilt of academia in the British context was palpable. We are now a part of the, as you know, the London University project. Reference was made to this, Nick Draper's work, Catherine Hall, and the project at London University. But our challenge is now to move them into advocacy. Okay, so you go to the archives and you discover some interesting historical documents and you build a narrative. Very good. What's your next step? How do we move them now into advocacy? How do we move them into a principled commitment to the discourse of social justice for everyone? Where does it begin and where does it end? And so this notion of reparatory history and getting rid of the hate history is interesting. David's documentary, which was discussed, I appeared in that documentary. I encourage him to, in his work on it. But his choice was just to give the British people small bites. Were he to say to them, okay, a survey was done by a group of actuaries out of the City of London that said, let us see how much money you owe the descendants of enslaved people in the Caribbean. You enslave over 2 million people. Let us calculate how much you would owe them if you paid back pay based upon the lowest paid worker in the British economy in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And in those 3 centuries, the lowest paid workers were unskilled agricultural workers. 3 pence a week. You do the calculation and say, well, let us pay the enslaved people the same wage that you would have paid the workers in England at the lowest level. What would the calculation, how much would you owe them? And then the figure came to, I think it was 7 trillion pounds. This is what you would end up owing these people. Your back pay bill would be 7 trillion pounds. If you paid all of those enslaved people the lowest wage per day, as you paid your own workers back in England. The idea wasn't to, and of course that 7 trillion was more than the gross domestic product of the country. It was bigger than the British economy. But the purpose wasn't to scare the living daylights out of the British government. The whole purpose was just to show the British people the enormity of their dependence upon slavery. The enormity of the dependence, the enormity of the labor which you got for free over 300 years. What you have done, the debt you owe people, you use your military machine, you use your war machinery, and you militarily extracted $7 trillion of wealth, pounds of wealth out of people who you kept in captivity. The British government, like all the governments of Europe, they believe that they will get away with this. The whole conversation is based upon getting away with it. I heard a reference, someone spoke, I think the gentleman at the back spoke about Burke and so on, and how Burke looked at these matters philosophically and so on, and even going back even earlier, how John Locke looked at it, treaties of liberty and freedom and so on. But black people, I mean, while Locke was writing his treatise on liberty, and he was a slave owner in the Bahamas, and he was also the corporate secretary of the Royal African Company that was established as the primary slave trading company in Great Britain, and he was the secretary, kept the minutes, kept the records, he was an investor, but he was writing his theory on liberty and freedom. But the way he did that was to say, okay, I'm not contradicting myself. No, black people are not within my paradigm because they're not human. And simple. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about white people. So, you know, the integrity of Locke. I mean, and all of us as students of philosophy, then we had to take Locke seriously. How do you take people like that seriously? Yeah, as quintessential philosophers in a society, you cannot take them seriously. They're propagandists. But they will get away with it. This is their view. How do we get away with this? The main argument is that let us deny and resist for as long as possible. So if we deny and resist for the next 1,000 years, then this conversation, then we are in a classroom here in Tulane 1,000 years from now. And we're talking about this thing as something that happened a long time ago. So let us say that their strategy, deny and resist. Deny, resist, disrupt. And push this as far. Let us see how far we can get into the future. Because the greater the distance from the site of the crime, the stronger your argument of remoteness. And you know, the British common law, they have this wonderful concept which they call remoteness. And how they test that? Well, the Romans colonized the Brits. Britain was part of the Roman Empire. We can't sue the Caesar. The descendants of the British people cannot bring a case against any of the Caesars because it was a long time ago. Right? When the Normans came over the Channel and did what they did, oh, you cannot sue the Normans. It was a long time ago. And so the remoteness. But this African Holocaust was not a long time ago. This is not the Roman Empire. This is not some medieval attempt by the French to come over the Channel and enslave the British people. No, no, no. This is very recent. Very recent. My great-grandmother was a slave. My great-great-grandmother, we heard about her. In my household, grew up hearing about her. Very recent. There are people in the Caribbean today, in Brazil, in this country, whose great-great-grandparents were slaves. It's in the household. It's there around us, the memory. We know the people. The stories are there. And so long as it is within living memory, so long as every household or any household has living memory of this, it is not remote. But there is this wonderful device that has always been used to justify these crimes. And again, the gentleman mentioned this. There is this wonderful device called the national interest. Anytime you hear that concept, national interest, run for your life. You know something wicked is about to happen. The moment you hear that, this is in the national interest. There were people all over Europe in the 17th and the 16th and 17th century who were saying, this thing is wrong. This thing is a crime. This thing is evil. This thing is wicked. There were people saying that all over the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. But they were brushed aside easily because it was in the national interest. The enslavement of African peoples was formulated as an economic, social, and political system because it was in the national interest. And who determines the national interest? Who controls that concept? Who frames that concept? Who imposes it upon society? Invariably those who own the capital. Invariably those who own the state. Invariably those who are determining the trajectory of an entire society as a place where they make money and control power. They make that determination in the national interest. And now the question is reparations in the national interest? Hell no. Every 90% of the citizens walking across the streets of Europe today, if you poll them, they would say that reparations is not in the national interest. Because they have the tools available to them. And here are the tools. They have the tools available. What are the tools? Why should I have to pay reparations? I didn't enslave anyone. I'm not responsible for what my great-great-grandparents did. That's their business. I'm not. That's the first tool. I did not benefit from what my ancestors did, and therefore, since I did not become enriched in any way from what they did, why should I have to pay? Well, it's a nice, cozy argument, but it doesn't fit. Yes, you benefited, every one of you. Every one of you, yes, you benefited. You got better economies to live in. You got democratic rights to enjoy. You had a surplus in your societies. You have the benefits of colonization and imperial exploitation. You built a world on white supremacy. You use white supremacy as a political tool. Whiteness becomes a privilege. Whiteness becomes an asset. The asset has market value. Yes, every white person has benefited. You cannot escape that. And much the same way that every black person has been a victim. You know, there are many black people in Africa who would say to you, oh, my ancestors were never enslaved. You know, we were able to protect ourselves from it. Of course, there are many families in Africa that were able to protect themselves from it. But you do not protect yourself from your community. If your community is ravished by a process and you are not, you cannot say, I have not been a victim. Your community has been ravished, and therefore you are a victim. And then you have the other argument that says, well, the Africans victimized themselves. They were our partners in this business. The whole theory of African collaboration and partnership, that was the school of thought that I grew up in as a historian from my professors. They all wrote about how Africans were the partners of the Europeans in this global crime. And therefore, we are not culpable, we're not guilty, because the Africans were our partners. When we went to India and we colonized India, well, the Indians were our partners too. They collaborated, yes. And I would say this. Is there any crime on a global scale that does not require a local collaborator? And does the local collaborator make the crime more heinous or less so? Let's say all of the drugs that pass through this country, let's say wherever it's coming from, let's say the narcotics, wherever they're coming from, and they're passing through New Orleans Harbor or Miami Airport. How do they get through Miami Airport and New Orleans Port? How do they get through? There has to be someone on the ground who says, let that container pass. There has to be someone who says, that ship is going to arrive at 3 p.m., let it go through. There has to be a local collaborator. But no one says as a result of that the people of America are narcotics traders. Does anyone jump to that conclusion? And therefore the people of America are all narcotics traders? Or that the government of the United States of America is a narcotics trader? We don't go there. We recognize there are local collaborators. We recognize that there's local enrichment. We recognize that there are always people on the ground who facilitate crimes. But when you commit a crime that victimizes an entire community, the local participant makes the crime even more heinous. And it is no argument that can be used to allow the principal partner in that process to escape justice. And we have to be honest about these things. We are interested, therefore, in building a global movement for justice. And I believe that the movement has reached a considerable distance along. Like my child in secondary school, I think we're getting close to the top of this. I think we're getting close to the top of it. And what we have to deal with now is the institutionalization of this movement. Yes, we can call for the commitment of academics. We can ask academics to bring their commitment to a level of passion, to a level of participation in civil movements, to a level of participation in institutional development. Tulane has a great conference. What will be the legacy of this? at the University of the West Indies, we had to institutionalize it after we spoke about it. The fact is that the case is made. The research has been done. The case has been made. What is the next step? The evidentiary basis of the case has been established concretely. If the evidentiary base of the case has been established, and we proceed on the basis that it has not been established, or we proceed on the basis that, yes, we have the evidence, but we're going to do nothing about it, then are we entering another round of complicity? And how do we deal with this whole matter of responsibility within a culture of complicity? These are important, very important issues. Laying the foundation at my university, Professor Shepherd and myself, we built the Center for Reparations Research. We moved the conversation to the level of governments. And we recognize that Caribbean governments have a vital role to play in this movement. Vital, absolutely critical. Because the Caribbean is the one place in the world where the descendants of the enslaved have political power. They don't have that political power in this country. They don't have it in Brazil. They have it nowhere else. In the Caribbean, our governments are manned by women and men who are the descendants of the enslaved. And therefore, they are in a unique position to use that governmental authority to move this conversation into every international forum in the United Nations and in courts, and importantly, to move it into the realm of intergovernmental diplomacy. Reparations is invariably the outcome of a dialogue between governments. Invariably, it's an outcome of the dialogue between governments. Civil societies can make their cases. Individuals can go to courts and tribunals, and we've heard, and they can win victories. They can win many victories. But the mega victory invariably is a dialogue between governments and states. And that is what the history has shown us. And therefore, we have argued that the Caribbean governments, therefore, must use their unique position to take advantage of the avenues through the international institutional system. And this is what we were able to persuade them to do. And this is why they unanimously agreed to write to all the governments of Europe that were involved in this global crime and to say to them, the case is here. You have a case to answer. The evidence is clear. Let us meet and summit to discuss this. It's the same conversation that happened with independence. The governments, the colonies said, no, we are not doing this colonial thing anymore. We need to discuss independence. And then you have a summit and you discuss it. So we have said to them, we need to discuss this in summit. The enormity of that development, sometimes it's almost beyond the imagination. That 17 governments can go into a room and agree. And the Caribbean world is the most fragmented world in the world. It was built to be fragmented. But yet every prime minister in that room agreed. The Europeans have received their letters and they have responded. And they have responded typically. I mean, we imagine that you move step by step. If you write to someone and say, well, you've committed these crimes and let us talk about repairing it, you have three scenarios. They can say, go to hell. They can say, well, are you sure this is the way to go? Or they can say, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it. And all the European governments, one by one, said, yes, we realize that there's some issues here. Yes, we know there's some issues, some residual legacy issues, yes. But we don't think this is the way to go. We give you some more aid. You want more aid? Some more handouts, okay. That's the first round. You always expect a first round. So we are now preparing for the second round. Maybe 2 or 3 rounds, but that's how it works. That's how it works. And you're building your pyramid, this is not an overnight thing. This is a big issue. But the biggest problem for us is black doubt. It's the biggest issue facing the movement. There's no doubt. The biggest issue facing this movement is black doubt. Black people are not sure. But why should they be sure? If you were an enslaved person in the Caribbean in 1830, could you have imagined emancipation in your lifetime? No enslaved person anywhere in this hemisphere, 10 years before emancipation legislation was passed, could have seen themselves and their children free. They couldn't have imagined it. Because they had been enslaved for 400 years. And 400 years is a hell of a long time. And when you have been enslaved for 300-400 years, you can't imagine any kind of future other than slavery. More of the same. That's all you can imagine. People will fight. They will rebel. A few people will always imagine it. A few people will always imagine it. But the majority can never imagine it. And that is why right now, the majority of black folks cannot imagine reparations. They can't imagine it. And they say, yeah, not in my lifetime. And why do they say that? Because they know that white supremacy has a built-in logic to keep rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling. It doesn't stop and say, let's reflect. Let us reflect and take a different perspective. Let us reflect and look at morality. Let us stop and speak about the ethical nature of life. Let us stop and imagine a more humane world. Let us stop and imagine civilizations having a dialogue. It doesn't imagine those things. It can't. It rolls on and on. Now, so there's no reason why the majority of black folks should be able to imagine reparations. But it is the duty of the minority to keep fighting until that majority is diminished. Until it's diminished. Nobody could have imagined you assassinate Martin Luther King, you assassinate Malcolm X. Can you imagine Barack Obama? No. Every black leader who pops up, you put a bullet in their head, and then you do that as a matter of course. Then up comes a young man who becomes the president. You couldn't see that one coming. History does that. We're all professionals. It moves slowly. Nelson Mandela was right. It is always impossible until it happens. And that is why we have to keep pushing and building this movement. But my final point on this matter is this. Why did we succeed in the Caribbean in moving this dialogue along? We succeeded to some extent in kicking the can down the road because we redefined the movement. White folks define reparations as black folks standing on street corners wanting handouts from white folks. That is how it was defined. It's like in the 60s when Martin Luther King was speaking about integration. And the established white supremacy media said, okay, we know what he means by integration. He really wants black men to marry white girls. And that is what he means by integration. And that's how they come at you. They come at you like that. So now they've come at us in the way that says, oh, okay, these lazy black people want a handout from white folks. So we have defined it quite differently. We have defined it as we understand it. And we said in the Caribbean, reparatory justice is about responsibility for a development paradigm. And we said to the British, you extracted wealth from these islands for over 400 years. Spain, Portugal, all of you. You extracted the wealth, you enslaved the people. Then at the end of that process, the people stand up, demand their independence, and they become independent. But they started their independence with massive poverty. Britain took Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655 and ruled Jamaica from 1655 to 1962. Enslaved them, colonized them, brutalized them. Each time they rose up, send in the army, slaughter them. They rise up for justice, army goes in, slaughter them. You run that system for 300 years. The people become free, independence. 80% of them can't read or write. 80% of them are illiterate. 3/4 of them are living in ghettos in town and country. Poor infrastructure, destroyed agriculture, no industrial significance. A culture of violence, the use of laws in a violent and oppressive way. The constant daily murdering of people who stood up against you, leaving behind a legacy of violence. And then you say to them, now go and develop. Go and develop. Go and turn around in 50 years the damage that has been done in 300 years, turn it around in 50 years. And if you can't do that, you are a failed state. You have failed. And you are not developing because you are incompetent. You are not developing because you're black. And you have no culture of transformation. Your culture is holding you back. That's what they say. It's the latest rationale. And so we have said, okay, you have a responsibility to come back to the site of the crime and participate in cleaning up this mess that you have left behind. You have a legal, political, and moral responsibility to come back to this site where you committed these crimes and participate in development. In development. And therefore for us, the reparatory justice movement is about social and economic development. It's about education, building schools and colleges. It's about technology and scientific transformation. It's about agricultural modernization. It's about apologizing for the crime you have committed against these people. It's about accepting that you have brutalized these people for centuries and you have left a legacy of violence which you have to help us to deal with. It's about accepting your share of the responsibility. We're not asking you to come and tell us what to do. We know what we have to do. We're saying to you, you have to come back here and work with us to clean up your mess. That is how we defined it. And in the case of individuals, the Rastafarian people, for example, who made a very clear view. We are stolen people. All stolen people have a right to be returned from whence they came. you have to work with us on a project to return those people who wish to be returned, to work with us on a global project to recite those people who wish to go home. Rastafarian people says we want to go home. We are stolen people. And it's important. And we in academia have a duty to assist them. For example, on my campus, where I was principal until recently in Barbados, we have a monument called Qua's Quest on the campus. Why Qua? 1799, a slave ship arrived in the Bridgetown Harbor. The auction started 6 hours after the ship arrived. And on the auction block were 298 Africans from Guinea. 298 from Guinea were on the auction block. And in that batch was a 3-year-old child called Qua. A slave owner purchased 21 Africans from that batch and asked for the 3-year-old child to be thrown in as a bonus. And he got the 3-year-old child because he too had a 3-year-old child, and he wanted a toy for his child. And so Qua was thrown in as a toy for the slave owner's 3-year-old child. Now, Qua becomes a teenager, and they realize that this child has an extraordinary quantitative capacity, that he could multiply in large numbers all in his head, and they couldn't figure this out. So he became a bit of an anomaly. So the slave owner trained him to be the accountant. So he is now 14 years old, and he's the bookkeeper for the plantation. At 14, the bookkeeper. He's a numbers guy, a nerd. Numbers guy, numbers. At emancipation, the Church of England builds a chapel on the land. And recognizing Qua's intellectual gifts, they gave Qua the job as sexton of the church. He becomes the first black sexton of an Anglican church anywhere in the world. Then comes the cholera epidemic, 1854, and he gets cholera, he's dying. But in those days, if you're part of the church, you tell your story. So he's on his bed, and he's telling his story. The raid on his village. Parents killed. He has a memory of being grabbed and taken somewhere, but he survives. He tells the story, and then he dies. So we have his life story in our archives. But the campus is built on the land where Qua was a slave. So when he became the sexton, he held Sunday school classes. So every Sunday morning, all the little black children, and he would teach them to read and write. Then the adults wanted classes, and he would teach the adults how to read and write. So Qua becomes the first teacher of the university campus. The land on which the campus is now located, Qua was the first teacher. 3 years old when he arrived. Now, the university therefore has the responsibility to recognize him as our ancestral professor and to memorialize him, and then to say to every student on that campus, you have a duty to join in Qua's quest for justice. And that's how we build the movement. So that's where we are now. We have transformed the reparatory justice movement into a broader conversation about development, transformation, health, education, culture, identity. And there are many black folks who says, I don't want a damn from white folks. I just want them to say sorry. I don't want their money. I don't want anything from them. I just want them to say sorry for what they have done to us. And then they can go their own way. And there are other black folks who said, no, this is about financial compensation. They have to compensate. You do not take free labor and don't pay something towards that. So within the black community, there is tremendous diversity of thought. It's a big tent. Within the white community, there's a great diversity of thought. And so all of us are diverse. My view is that within that diversity, we need to craft an institutional path. And if it means going to the United Nations as we have done, if it means going to the World Court as we are now planning to do, if it means working through diplomacy with European governments, we will. But whatever institutional path is now available, we will take. Because at the end of this, I would like to imagine that all of our efforts will be used to achieve one thing. All of our efforts will be used to achieve one objective, and it is this. That in the years ahead, in the decades ahead, and the centuries ahead, whoever commit these crimes against humanity must be held accountable. And if we can establish that in the world, if we can establish that benchmark in the world, that whoever commit these crimes, white, black, brown, whoever they are, who commit these crimes against the human species must be held accountable. I believe we will have a better world if we can establish that principle. Thank you.
Questions before we break for lunch. Is that okay? So I see Ajwa in the back.
Frantically waiting. Thank you. This was an excellent presentation. I think I may have heard you speak some time ago, and I've heard a lot about you from people in the reparations movement in the United States who have been working with CARICOM. My question is, you highlighted or summarized what the Caribbean nations were doing in Europe. How do you see the CARICOM working with those of us in the United States who are also part of the reparations movement globally and are seeking reparatory justice from the United States?
Let me say this. We don't have to work with anyone. We are all together in this. The Caribbean discourse was fueled by the energy of the Black Lives Matter movement. One conversation empowers the next conversation. We're all in this together. I don't see the Caribbean as a space. The Caribbean is just a jurisdiction in which we happen to be dwelling. This is a global movement, and so we have said that our communities, wherever they are, must establish commissions. So now we have an African American Reparations Commission here in this country, and we are part of that. We are logically twinned by the hip. So we are one movement. So we have a chapter here, we have a chapter in the Caribbean. We now have a chapter in Colombia. We have a chapter in Brazil. We have a chapter in Costa Rica, Panama. We have a chapter now in Venezuela. We are now working with chapters that are emerging across Africa. There is a chapter in India. So basically, we are asking communities all over the world to build their reparations commission. And then the plan is that sometime this summer, I think it's in July, we're hoping that all of these commissions will come together in Benin at this conference which is being planned. So imagine then 2 years from now that we have 20,000 people gathered in one place because they're all members of these global reparations commissions. And these are the institutions that will give us the traction we're looking for. There's a European Union Reparations Commission that has membership from Spain and France and Portugal, everywhere else. So we have one in Britain as well. So all of these movements are being built and constructed, and then we will use them as the vehicles to influence global politics and global diplomacy.
So I've been chastised that our lunch is ready and getting cold, but I'll take one more.
Thank you, Professor Beckles, for that scintillating talk. I truly appreciate your kindness and your insight. I have a quick comment and a small question. At the height of the freedom movement in India, a British journalist interviewed Mr. Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. And he said, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think about Western civilization? And Gandhi said, Western civilization? That's a wonderful idea. I have a question for you. The question is as follows. You assigned a role for governments in this dialogue, and that point is well taken. You know India was the jewel in the crown of the British Raj and was subject to unprecedented levels of plunder and theft. That was then. Indian agriculture was destroyed and so on and so forth. Shipbuilding, steel, etc., etc., etc. 2005, the Indian Parliament enacted what was called the Nuclear Liability Act. And this act limited the liability of foreign corporations, particularly American corporations like GE and so on, in the event of a nuclear accident. India is in the process of building 250 nuclear reactors because we have a major energy crisis. And as condition of building these nuclear reactors, the American government forced the Indian Parliament to pass a law limiting the liability, come what may, to just about $500 million. And the government of India capitulated in the face of severe popular opposition. If this is how the governments are, and if we keep in mind the fact that all governments virtually in the context of globalization are part of a transnational capitalist class, how can we trust governments to further this agenda? Thank you.
That's a very good question. And bear in mind that when I speak of the role for universities or for governments, I am not idealizing them. I am not saying that they're not capable of participating in the furtherance of some of these problems that we're faced in the modern world. I am merely saying that you have a debate and a discourse, and you are able to mobilize the power of a government on that matter. Now, because they agree with you and support you on that matter, it does not mean that they will not cut you down on other areas. So it is not an idealistic concept of governments. We know what governments are. If a government has 20 items on its agenda, there are 20 items on its agenda, and you're hoping to win this support on 2 of them, well, you fight to get this support on 2 of them. You know that they will not support you on 16. But the 2 that they support you on, you take it and you move. And this is an instance in which our governments have said, this conversation has been going on in the region for hundreds of years. And the time has come for us to support civil society. It isn't the governments are leading, they have come on board in respect of rising popular opinion. So that has to be celebrated. But there are many other areas, my friend, as you know, as you have just said, there are many other areas where it's dark. It's very, very dark. But that is the nature of political reality. You don't win everything. And like India, there are many areas in the Caribbean where I believe the governments do not act in the best interest of the black people, but they are black governments. And that is the nature of it. So I'm not wearing, pink glasses. I can see the dark patches, and I can see the areas of enlightenment, and I can see the areas of darkness. And we navigate the best we can. And hopefully, 10 years from now, another Indian government might be persuaded to renege on those agreements and change directions. So we hope for that. And this is why I think the voice of academia is so important, especially in India, in a circumstance such as this. But thank you for that. It's clear. That's clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.